How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 9th video on the channel, and today we're going to be ending the 4th section of Ferdinand de Saussure's course in General Linguistics, titled Diachronic Linguistics. Last time, we looked at how analogy and phonetic change function, whilst today, I hope to fully finish off this section by looking at the last 4 chapters. Firstly, analogy and evolution, then folk etymology, followed by agglutination, and finally, but not at all leastly, diachronic units, identities, and realities. The first chapter is split into 3 subsections, beginning with how analogical innovation enters language. This follows directly on from where we left off last video, Saussure stating,
"Nothing enters language without having been tested in speaking, and every evolutionary phenomenon has its roots in the individual."
To give a little recap, last time we looked at the formation of a Latin word honor, meaning honor. Rather than being formed through phonetic change, it developed through what Saussure called analogy. First, there was an original form, honos, that was related to an accusative form, honosem. Then, through a phonetic change, the S between vowels in honosem became an R. This led to the creation of a competitor to honos in the form of honor, a derivative creation from honorem, based on the pattern of other words in Latin like orator and oratorem. This formation wasn't a change, because rather than being descended from honos, honor was created by one speaker by chance and coexisted with the former before overtaking it in popularity. The point Saussure wants to emphasize in this subchapter is this idea that something is created then substituted in. Analogy itself isn't a source of evolution, of change. It all rests on substitution and innovation. This brings us swiftly along to the next subchapter, titled Analogical Innovations as Symptoms of Changes in Interpretation. He begins by asking how interpretation is able to change so drastically from generation to generation. In his words,
"The cause of change must be sought in the great mass of forces that constantly threaten the analysis adopted in a particular language state."
The first of these forces is phonetic evolution. Again, as we went over last video, phonetic change acts as a disturbing force, covering up grammatical bonds between words as they drift apart. It emphasizes existing differences between word forms, eventually leading to the destruction of visible connections between them. Agglutination is another such force, one that we'll explore further at a later point. It deals largely with having small units fitting together similar to a puzzle, phonetic change then coming in to blur the lines dividing them. In passing, Saussure says, we also have to take note of a general tendency to shorten the radical root of a word in favor of the other parts that make it up. However, no matter how it starts, changes in interpretation depend on analogy. It manifests itself as a force that regulates change, changing seemingly arbitrary forms to contain some sort of regularity, like honor and honorem as we looked at earlier. It may not be an evolutionary fact in itself, being grammatical and synchronic in nature, but it collaborates with all of the other forces of language to sanction new combinations of words based on pre-existing forms. We now get to the last subchapter of analogy and evolution, analogy as a renovating and conservative force. Here, he is mainly concerned with looking at just that. There's not too much to say here, other than what forms are preserved through analogy constantly renew themselves as seen in the template of orator and oratorem. The only place where rivals and thus analogy don't show up are in cases of isolated words like proper nouns. Concluding this section, he says that forms can be kept for 2 completely different reasons. The first being isolation, and the second being integration into a system. No matter what, analogy plays a very important role. This brings us to folk etymology, the 6th chapter of the section. Unlike many of the other chapters, it isn't split into any subsections. Saussure starts off by saying this:
"We sometimes mangle words that have unfamiliar forms and meanings, and usage sometimes sanctions these deformations."
The example he offers of this phenomenon, given the name folk etymology, is how the old French word coup de poing from coute meaning quilt and point meaning cover, became courte-point, as if from words meaning short and point respectively. At first glance, Saussure says, this may seem indistinguishable from analogy. However, there are numerous differences. On the surface, for example, we can see that whilst analogical forms are produced rationally in order to keep some sense of regularity, folk etymologies are much more haphazard and lead to absurdities. Going deeper, we need to first understand some of the different types of folk etymologies. The first type is that of words that gain new interpretations without their form changing. For example, the Old French word souffrette once meant privation, but evolved into the adjective souffreteux, meaning sickly. The second type occurs when speakers deform words in order to fit with what they think they are related to. For example, the word calfêtre in French, meaning to caulk, became colfeutre, under the influence of the word feutre, which meant felt. What sticks out is that in all these examples, there are parts of a word that don't change. For example, sous and cal. It's as if folk etymology stopped halfway through. These are simply parts that can't be interpreted on their own. It's thus that, as Saussure says,
the degree of deformation does not create radical differences between words corrupted by folk etymologies. All these words are pure and simple interpretations of misunderstood forms.
This shows us how it differs from analogy. Folk etymology always recalls the original form, just in a muddled way, whilst analogy takes nothing from that form and instead creates something else entirely. This brings us to the penultimate chapter we'll be looking at today, titled Agglutination. This one is split into two subsections, the first being definition, and the second being agglutination and analogy. He begins by explaining what exactly agglutination is. In his words, it is the welding together of two or more distinct terms that often appear together in syntagms, linear chains of multiple units that gain their meaning from each other, like re and do in redo. An example of agglutination is the French word ceci, meaning this, which originally was composed of two words. The same thing occurred with aujourd'hui, today, originally composed of a longer syntagm that meant on today's day. Agglutination is a process, rather than a procedure, in that it is characterized by a lack of intention in its occurrences. Syntagms simply collapse into themselves, as it were. In Saussure's eyes, we can determine three phases in the construction of agglutination. There's first the combining of several terms that form a syntagm. Then there's the agglutination proper, where the units that make up the syntagm are synthesized together. And finally, there are phonetic changes that make the new term act more like a standard word, such as the unification of accents. This takes us to agglutination and analogy, which he starts out by contrasting the two, listing three reasons why. Firstly, the fact that in agglutination, two or more units are blended together with synthesis, as such as in the case of the French word encore, from French hancorem, or Latin, This is directly opposed to analogy, which builds upon new terms from smaller units. Next, agglutination works through syntagms, whilst analogy additionally works through association, where relationships between words are connected in the mind of speakers. The third reason Saussure gives is that agglutination is not willful nor active. What this means is that agglutination just appears mechanically as spontaneous mergers. This is in contrast to analogy, which requires the active connection of terms to pre-existing forms. We end now at the very last chapter of Diachronic Linguistics, titled Diachronic Units, Identities, and Realities. Saussure's starting point is, like what is shown in this diagram, diachronic change doesn't occur in a straight line, with direct correspondence between periods. Rather, diachronic evolution is more accurately represented by something like this. To demonstrate this point, Saussure takes the example of the lack of prepositions in Proto-Indo-European. Through diachronic change, these eventually came to exist in Stolta languages, showing that diachrony doesn't simply create equivalence through time. He returns now to something we looked at quite a few episodes back, the fact that any change includes a shift between the signifier and the signified. In his eyes, this is all diachronic phenomena are. However, Saussure says, there's also the problem of diachronic units complicating it all. Diachronic units are what are subject to diachronic change. These are the possible words that shift through evolution. With this, he goes to move towards diachronic identity. At first glance, we may say that diachronic identity is the same as phonetic identity. In other words, that it simply corresponds to the changes between an older form and a modern form, like French chaud from Latin calidum. However, there's still something of a problem.
To say that these correspondences account for identity is to reverse the facts.
This is all because we can only deduce this after the fact, by comparing the different forms. All in all, identity is more complicated than just sound. It must include a reference to meaning too. Now, this concludes the second half of Diachronic Linguistics, from Ferdinand de Saussure's course in General Linguistics. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better next time. Then, we'll move on to the appendices to the section and the section on synchronic linguistics.